All right, let's go. Number 10. The Toba super eruption. Approximately 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia, the Earth detonated. The eruption of Mount Toba registered an 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the highest classification the scale can assign. To grasp what that means, consider that each step on the index represents a tenfold increase in ejected material. A VEI 5 flattens a mountain and darkens a region. A VEI 7 reshapes a hemisphere's climate for years. Toba was a VEI 8. Nothing larger has occurred in the last 2 million years. The eruption expelled an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The scar it left behind is so vast it took satellite imagery to fully appreciate its dimensions. The Lake Toba caldera, now filled with water and ringed by jungle, stretches 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. It remains the largest volcanic lake on Earth, a wound in the planet's crust so enormous it is visible from orbit. Ash from the event has been identified in sediment cores across the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and in soil deposits as far west as Lake Malawi in eastern Africa, more than 7,000 kilometers from the source. Across the Indian subcontinent, layers of Toba ash up to 15 centimeters thick have been recovered from archaeological sites, blanketing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers in a suffocating gray shroud that would have buried vegetation, poisoned water sources, and choked every breathing thing beneath it. But the crater and the ash were only the beginning. The real destruction came from what the eruption threw into the sky. In 1998, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois published a paper that connected Toba to a puzzle geneticists had been wrestling with for years. Human genetic diversity is extraordinarily low compared to other species. Chimpanzees confined to a single forest in Central Africa possess more genetic variation than the entire human population of 8 billion. Something, at some point in our deep past, had reduced our species to an extraordinarily small breeding population. Ambrose proposed that Toba was the answer. The eruption injected billions of tons of sulfur dioxide and fine ash into the stratosphere. Sunlight dimmed across the planet. Global temperatures fell by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Some models suggest a volcanic winter lasting a full decade, with regional cooling reaching far more severe extremes at higher latitudes. Growing seasons collapsed. Vegetation died. The forests and savannas that early humans depended on withered beneath an ash-choked sky that refused to clear. What makes this event particularly disturbing is the population estimate that emerges from the genetic record. The total human breeding population may have collapsed to between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Not 3,000 in a single region, 3,000 in total, on the entire planet. Every human being alive today, every civilization that has ever existed, every language ever spoken, every monument ever raised, may descend from a group small enough to fill a single sports stadium. Our species did not merely struggle. We came within a generation or two of being erased. Some researchers continue to dispute the severity of the bottleneck. Archaeological sites in southern Africa and India show evidence of human persistence through the eruption window without obvious disruption. The debate continues in journals and conferences. But what no one disputes is the eruption itself, its magnitude, and the fact that something in our deep past compressed human genetic diversity to levels that should not exist in a species this widespread. The implication is what lingers. If the winds had carried the ash differently, if the eruption had been marginally larger, if those few thousand survivors scattered across an ash-poisoned world had been slightly less fortunate, every story humanity has ever told would have ended before it began. There would have been no civilization to erase, because there would have been no one left to build it. The entire arc of human history balanced on a few thousand starving people, watching a sky that had turned to poison, waiting for a sun that took years to return. Number 9. The Younger Dryas Impact. Approximately 12,800 years ago, at the precise moment the Earth was clawing its way out of the last ice age, something arrived from the sky. In 2007, nuclear physicist Richard Firestone and a team of 25 researchers published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, proposing that a comet or asteroid, possibly fragmenting upon atmospheric entry, detonated over the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America. The resulting airburst did not crater. It did not leave a single neat scar. It distributed its violence across an entire hemisphere and then sent the planet plunging back into Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years. This period is called the Younger Dryas. Its onset represents one of the most abrupt climate reversals in the geological record. A warming that should have continued for thousands of years simply stopped. Greenland ice cores show temperatures in the North Atlantic region collapsing by approximately 7 degrees Celsius within decades, not centuries. Decades. The interglacial that had been melting glaciers reversed itself as if a switch had been thrown. The evidence is embedded in a thin geological layer found at more than 50 sites across 4 continents. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas boundary layer, and what it contains is not what ordinary terrestrial sediment is supposed to contain. Nanodiamonds, formed only under temperatures and pressures consistent with cosmic impact. Microspherules, tiny glass beads created when rock melts and resolidifies midair. Elevated concentrations of platinum, an element rare on Earth's surface but common in extraterrestrial bodies. And at numerous North American sites, the boundary contains a carbon-rich layer of scorched sediment, so distinctive it has its own name. The black mat. It is the residue of continent-wide wildfires, a charred horizon laid down across thousands of kilometers in what appears to be a single geological instant. Above the black mat, the bones disappear. The Clovis culture, one of the earliest well-documented human populations in North America, vanishes from the archaeological record precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary. Their distinctive fluted spear points, found across the continent in earlier sediment layers, simply stop appearing. A sophisticated, continent-spanning hunting culture that had colonized an entire hemisphere is there in one layer and gone in the next. No transitional phase, no gradual decline, no descendant tradition carrying forward their toolkit. They are present, and then they are absent, and the line between is a band of soot. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. Whatever erased the Clovis people did not stop with them. Within the same narrow window, North America experienced a megafaunal extinction of staggering proportions. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American camels, American horses, dire wolves. Roughly 35 genera of large mammals, animals that had survived multiple glacial cycles, animals whose lineages stretched back millions of years, vanished from the Americas during or immediately after the Younger Dryas onset. Species that had walked the continent for longer than our species has existed were erased in a span of time so brief that geologists struggle to resolve it. The hypothesis remains fiercely debated. Critics argue the nanodiamonds could have alternative origins, that the extinctions reflect human overhunting, that the cooling was triggered by meltwater disruption of the Atlantic circulation rather than cosmic impact. The debate continues in journals and at conferences, but the alignment is impossible to ignore. At precisely 12,800 years ago, temperatures collapsed. The sediments of an entire continent turned black with fire. A sophisticated human culture disappeared from the archaeological record, and 35 genera of large mammals went extinct simultaneously. Whether the trigger was an object from space, a flood of glacial meltwater, or something we have not yet identified, the event itself is undeniable. A world was ending. What makes the Younger Dryas particularly haunting is what it forecloses. Whatever cultural trajectory the Clovis people were on, Whatever civilizations might have eventually emerged from their expansion across two continents, none of it materialized. The survivors started over in a world that had reverted to Ice Age conditions, surrounded by the skeletons of animals their grandchildren would never see. A continent's worth of possibility was incinerated in an afternoon, and the bones of what was lost are still being pulled from the black layer, still waiting in the sediment for someone to finally agree on what killed them. Number 8. The Storegga Slide. The wall of water that finished what the rising sea had started. Approximately 8,200 years ago, off the coast of Norway, a section of the continental shelf roughly the size of Scotland detached from the seabed and slid into the deep ocean. There was no warning, no earthquake felt on land, no surface tremor that any human standing on a Mesolithic beach could have interpreted as a threat. The seafloor simply gave way. In 2014, a team of marine geologists led by Peter Tolling at the National Oceanography Center in Southampton published findings that quantified the scale of what had happened. The slide displaced approximately 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment. To put that volume into terms a human mind can almost hold, it was the equivalent of a block of earth 300 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide, and several hundred meters thick, collapsing into the Norwegian Sea in a matter of minutes. The largest known submarine landslide in the geological record of the North Atlantic. Possibly the largest of its kind on Earth. The water responded the only way water can. It moved. Along the Norwegian coast, waves reached estimated heights of 20 to 25 meters. The Shetland Islands, directly in the path of the displaced ocean, were struck by walls of water that geologists have traced through sediment deposits found 80 meters above modern sea level. Not 80 meters from shore, 80 meters above the sea. Sand and marine debris carried by the tsunami were deposited at altitudes that should be impossible for ocean water to reach. The eastern coast of Scotland received waves in excess of 20 meters. Sand layers from the Storegga event have been identified as far as 80 kilometers inland from the modern Scottish coastline, carried there by water that traveled across the open sea at speeds approaching 500 kilometers per hour. A wave faster than a commercial jet. A wave taller than a 6-story building. A wave with the entire mass of the Norwegian continental shelf behind it. But the most devastating impact was felt in a place that no longer appears on any map. Doggerland, already eroded by millennia of post-glacial sea level rise, had been reduced by 6,200 BC to a low-lying archipelago of islands, marshlands, and tidal flats. The Mesolithic communities still clinging to these remnants were among the most vulnerable populations on Earth. Low elevation, no high ground to flee to, surrounded on all sides by the sea that had been consuming their world for generations. When the Storegga wave reached them, the effect was total. 20-meter walls of water sweeping across a landscape that barely rose above sea level left nothing. The archaeological record of human habitation on the Doggerland remnants after approximately 6,200 BC effectively disappears. The tools stop appearing in the nets. The settlements stop appearing in the seismic surveys. Whatever cultures had persisted on those final islands, whatever languages they spoke, whatever they understood about the world that had been slowly drowning them for thousands of years, all of it was erased in a single afternoon. What makes the Storegga slide particularly unsettling is the silence that preceded it. Submarine landslides give no warning that any human technology of the time could have detected. There was no shaking, no premonition. The sea simply retreated, and then it came back wrong. The communities of Mesolithic Scotland, Norway, and the last Doggerland Islands had no framework for understanding why the ocean had suddenly risen 20 meters and was racing inland at speeds beyond anything in their experience. The wave reached them before any story about it could form. The Norwegian continental margin remains geologically active. Sediment continues to accumulate on slopes that have collapsed before. The conditions that produced the Storegga event have not been removed from the planet. They have simply been waiting, and the populations now living along the coastlines that the wave once swept across number in the tens of millions. The Mesolithic people the wave erased had no warning. In that respect, remarkably little has changed. Number 7. The Cerro Blanco eruption, the catastrophe the world forgot. In approximately 2300 BCE, in what is now Catamarca province in northwestern Argentina, a volcano detonated with a force that should have written itself into every history book ever printed. It didn't. The mountain that erupted has no name in popular memory. The cultures it destroyed have no monuments in any major museum. The event that geologists now recognize as one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the entire Holocene, the 12,000-year window in which all of human civilization has existed, is almost completely absent from public knowledge. The numbers do not permit this silence. The Cerro Blanco eruption registered a volcanic explosivity index of 7. To place that in scale, the eruption of Thera that ended the Minoan world was also a 7. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which was heard 4,800 kilometers away and altered global temperatures for years, was a 6. Each step on the scale represents a tenfold increase in ejected material. Cerro Blanco was not a regional event. It was a planetary event that happened to occur in a region with no written language to record it. Ash deposits from the eruption blanket an area of approximately 500,000 square kilometers of South America, reaching thicknesses of up to 30 centimeters in regions hundreds of kilometers from the caldera itself. Volcanic ash from Cerro Blanco has been identified in sediment cores recovered from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, carried eastward by stratospheric winds across an entire continent before settling into the deep sea. The caldera left behind in the southern Puna Plateau spans roughly 6 kilometers in diameter, a wound in the Andes that subsequent erosion has softened but never erased. Within 60 kilometers of the vent, pyroclastic flows incinerated everything they touched. These were not lava flows in the slow cinematic sense. Pyroclastic flows are avalanches of superheated gas and rock fragments traveling at speeds of several hundred kilometers per hour, reaching temperatures above 500 degrees Celsius. Any organism caught within their reach died in seconds. Vegetation flashed to carbon. Whatever architecture existed, whatever tools or stored grain or sleeping families, simply ceased to exist in a form recognizable to archaeology, and people lived there. The Andean foothills and high valleys surrounding Cerro Blanco supported early village societies during the 3rd millennium BCE, communities that practiced incipient agriculture, herded camelids, and built small permanent settlements along reliable water sources. The archaeological record across this broad region shows a pronounced disruption in the centuries following the eruption. Settlement patterns shift, population indicators collapse. The thread of continuous cultural development that connects earlier village societies to the later Andean civilizations passes through a layer of ash and an absence. But here's where the Cerro Blanco event becomes genuinely disturbing. We do not know what was lost. We have no inventory of the villages that stood within the kill zone. We have no estimate of the population that lived beneath the column of ash that rose into the stratosphere on that day in approximately 2300 BCE. Whatever they were building, whatever they believed about the mountains around them, whatever knowledge they had accumulated about herding and planting and surviving in one of the harshest inhabited landscapes on Earth, the eruption took it. And then, because no civilization with writing was watching, history took the memory of the loss itself. A Holocene-scale catastrophe occurred. Entire cultures were annihilated. The Atlantic seafloor still carries the fingerprint of the eruption in its mud, and the event sits almost entirely outside human awareness, a blank space on the map of remembered disasters, proof that scale alone does not guarantee a place in collective memory. Something can be vast enough to dust a continent and still be forgotten so completely that schoolchildren in the country it occurred in have never heard its name. Number 6. The drowned village of Atlit Yam. In 1984, marine archaeologist Ehud Galili was conducting a routine survey off the coast of Israel near Haifa when he noticed structures on the seabed that had no business being there. Stone circles, foundations, the geometry of human intention preserved beneath 12 meters of Mediterranean water. What Galili had found, lying quietly on the seafloor for over 8,000 years, was a complete Neolithic village, a community that had vanished so abruptly its inhabitants never finished eating. The site is called Atlit Yam. It dates to approximately 6,300 BC, placing it among the oldest sunken settlements ever discovered. The village occupied what was once a coastal plain at the edge of the Mediterranean, a fertile strip of land that supported a population of farmers, fishers, and herders during a period when agriculture was still a recent innovation in human history. The inhabitants built rectangular stone houses. They dug freshwater wells lined with carefully fitted stones. They erected a circle of 7 megaliths around what appears to have been a freshwater spring, monoliths weighing up to 600 kilograms arranged in a configuration that predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. And then, one day, the sea took it. The preservation is what makes Atlit Yam unbearable to contemplate. This isn't a ruin slowly abandoned. This isn't a settlement gradually surrendered to rising waters over generations. The evidence on the seafloor describes an event that happened faster than the inhabitants could respond. Excavations recovered human skeletons, positioned where they had been sitting moments before. Storage pits still contained fish, sorted and processed, never retrieved. Cooking implements lay where they had been set down. The dead were caught in the middle of ordinary life, in the middle of meals, in the middle of an afternoon that became their last. 65 skeletons have been recovered from the site. Among them, a mother and her infant found together, both showing the unmistakable bone lesions of tuberculosis. They represent the earliest confirmed cases of the disease in the archaeological record. 8,300 years before any physician would name it, tuberculosis was already moving through human communities, already killing mothers and children in coastal villages along the Mediterranean. The disease that would eventually kill more humans than any other infectious agent in history was already present at Atlit Yam, waiting in the lungs of a woman who would be drowned before her illness could finish her. The cause of the village's destruction has been narrowed by recent research to a single catastrophic event. Approximately 8,500 years ago, a section of Mount Etna's eastern flank collapsed into the Ionian Sea. The submarine landslide displaced an enormous volume of water and generated a tsunami that radiated across the eastern Mediterranean. Modeling suggests waves reaching coastal Israel within hours, striking communities that had no warning, no concept of tsunamis, no reason to look up from their meals at the sea they had lived beside for generations. What makes Atlit Yam particularly haunting isn't its scale. The village was small, perhaps a few hundred people at most. The horror lies in the intimacy of what was preserved. We can stand on the seafloor and see the wells they drank from. We can examine the stones they arranged. We can identify the fish they had set aside for the next day's eating. We can hold the bones of a mother who died holding her sick child. Every detail of an ordinary Neolithic afternoon is sitting in 12 meters of salt water off the Israeli coast, frozen at the moment the wave arrived. The people of Atlit Yam had no warning, no mythology that prepared them for what was coming from across the sea, no instinct that told them to run inland when the water pulled back. They were farmers and fishers in a small coastal village, and a mountain 1,000 kilometers away decided their afternoon would be their last. Their village is still down there, still arranged the way they left it. Number 5. The Burkle Crater Impact, when something fell from the sky and rewrote every flood myth on Earth. In 2006, a team of researchers calling themselves the Holocene Impact Working Group announced a discovery that mainstream geology has been arguing about ever since. Led by Dallas Abbott, a research scientist at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the group had been scanning the floor of the southern Indian Ocean for evidence of something that conventional Earth science said shouldn't be there. They found it 1,500 kilometers southeast of Madagascar, 3,800 meters below the surface. A circular depression in the seafloor, roughly 30 kilometers wide. They named it the Burckle Crater. And if they are correct about what it is, the implications rewrite the early history of human civilization. The crater itself is invisible to anyone who isn't looking for it. It sits in deep ocean, buried under sediment, detectable only through bathymetric survey and gravitational anomaly mapping. There are no mineral samples from its floor, no drilled cores, confirming impact glass or shocked quartz. The evidence for what Burckle is comes not from the crater itself, but from what surrounds it on the continents thousands of kilometers away. In southern Madagascar, along a stretch of coastline facing the proposed impact site, the landscape is marked by enormous sand formations called chevron dunes. V-shaped deposits oriented toward the ocean, some of them 200 meters tall and stretching for kilometers inland. Abbott and her colleagues argue these chevrons are the fingerprints of mega tsunamis, waves so large they ran up Madagascar's coast, deposited material at altitudes no normal storm surge could reach, and left behind microscopic marine fossils and deep sea sediments embedded in the sand. To produce chevrons that size, the modeling suggests waves approaching 200 meters in height. A column of water, taller than the Eiffel Tower, racing across the ocean and breaking against an entire continent's shore. The proposed date is approximately 2,800 BCE. That date is the part that makes the Burckle hypothesis genuinely disturbing. This wasn't a prehistoric impact striking an empty world. By 2,800 BCE, the cities of Sumer were already centuries old. Egypt was building the first pyramids. The Indus Valley was urbanizing. Coastal communities ringed every continental margin of the Indian Ocean from East Africa to southern Arabia to western India to Southeast Asia. If a 30-kilometer crater opened in the southern Indian Ocean during the early Bronze Age, the resulting waves would have struck inhabited coastlines on 3 continents within hours. Entire civilizations of fisherfolk, traders, and coastal farmers, populations that left no monuments because their settlements were swept into the sea, would have been annihilated in an afternoon. And then there are the stories. Every culture that ringed the affected ocean basin preserves a flood narrative dated to roughly this period. Mesopotamia produced the deluge accounts that fed into Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible. The Vedic traditions of India describe Manu surviving a world-drowning flood. Chinese mythology preserves the Great Flood of Gunyu. Coastal Aboriginal Australian traditions describe ancestral seas that rose and consumed entire territories. The Holocene Impact Working Group has argued, controversially, that these aren't independent inventions. They are the surviving fragments of a single witnessed event, retold across millennia by the descendants of those who happened to be standing on high enough ground to live through it. The mainstream geological community is not convinced. Critics argue the chevron dunes are wind-formed features, not tsunami deposits. They argue the Burckle Depression may be a tectonic feature rather than an impact crater. They argue that without shocked minerals or an iridium layer recovered from the crater itself, the case remains circumstantial. The debate continues in journals, at conferences, in increasingly pointed exchanges between Abbott's team and conventional impact geologists. But the depression is there. The chevrons are there. The flood myths are there. And the question the Holocene Impact Working Group has forced into the scientific literature refuses to dissolve. If something fell from the sky in 2800 BCE and dropped a wall of water onto the coastlines of the early Bronze Age world, we would not know the names of the people it killed. We would not know what languages they spoke or what gods they worshipped. We would only know that their descendants, the ones who survived on hills and inland plateaus, spent the next 5,000 years telling their children about the day the sea came for everything. The crater is still down there, 3,800 meters below the surface, unsampled, undrilled, waiting. Number 4. The Black Sea Deluge, when the ocean swallowed a civilization whole. In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published a hypothesis that would connect ancient geology to humanity's oldest story. Using sonar mapping and sediment cores from the floor of the Black Sea, they proposed that approximately 7,600 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea breached the land barrier at the Bosporus Strait and poured into what had been a freshwater lake sitting far below modern sea level. The flood was catastrophic, rapid, and devastating to the farming communities that had settled along the lake's fertile shores. Ryan and Pittman suggested this event might be the historical basis for the flood narratives found across the ancient Near East, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical story of Noah's Ark. The evidence beneath the Black Sea is striking. Sonar surveys have revealed ancient shorelines submerged 150 meters below the current surface. Sediment cores show an abrupt transition from freshwater deposits to marine sediments, a boundary so sharp it suggests the change happened in geological terms almost overnight. Below that boundary, freshwater mollusks. Above it, saltwater species appear suddenly and completely. Something transformed the Black Sea from a freshwater body to a saltwater one in a period too brief for gradual transition. Ryan and Pittman's models estimated the flood's intensity at approximately 200 times the flow rate of Niagara Falls. Saltwater cascaded through the Bosporus Channel with enough force to cut a gorge still visible in bathymetric surveys today. The lake's surface rose by as much as 15 centimeters per day. Shorelines retreated by over a kilometer daily in the flat northern sections of the basin. Within months, an area roughly the size of Ireland was submerged. Farming communities that had cultivated the lake shore for generations watched the water advance toward their fields, their homes, their burial grounds, with no way to stop it and nowhere along the shore to retreat. But here is where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. We know people lived along those shores. The fertile lowlands surrounding a freshwater lake in a semi-arid region would have been prime settlement territory during the early Neolithic. Communities in the broader region were already growing wheat, barley, and lentils, raising livestock, and building permanent structures. The lake shore would have supported some of the most productive farmland in the ancient Near East. Yet the archaeological record from those settlements is buried under 150 meters of saltwater, effectively inaccessible. In 2000, underwater explorer Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the wreck of the Titanic, conducted expeditions to the Black Sea floor and reported finding evidence of ancient shorelines and possible man-made structures preserved in the anoxic deep water. The Black Sea's unique chemistry, its deep layers contain almost no dissolved oxygen, means that organic material on the seafloor doesn't decompose normally. Wooden structures and biological remains that would have disintegrated millennia ago in any other body of water might still exist in the darkness 150 meters down. Perfectly preserved, beyond practical excavation. The debate over the deluge's speed and scale continues. Some geologists argue the flooding was more gradual, occurring over centuries rather than months. Others maintain that the sediment evidence demands a rapid event. But what remains undisputed is the fundamental sequence. The Black Sea was once a smaller, lower, freshwater body. It became a larger, higher saltwater sea. People lived on the shores that are now submerged, and the cultural memory of a catastrophic flood persists across nearly every civilization that emerged in the surrounding region. The implications extend further. If Ryan and Pittman are correct, The Genesis flood narrative is not metaphor and not theological invention. It is geological memory, transmitted across more than 5,000 years of oral tradition, surviving the rise and fall of Sumer, the Akkadian collapse, the Babylonian exile, until it reached the scribes who finally wrote it down. The story we read as scripture may be the last echo of a real morning when the Mediterranean broke through and a freshwater world began to disappear under a kilometer per day of advancing sea. Whatever those communities built, whatever they believed, whatever they understood about their lake and their land and their gods, the water took it all. Their houses still stand down there in the lightless, oxygen-starved deep, their wooden beams uncollapsed, their hearths cold, their grain stores intact under a sea that has held them in dark suspension for 76 centuries. Number 3. The Pavlo-Petri submersion, the Bronze Age town you can still walk through. In 1967, an oceanographer named Nicholas Fleming was conducting a survey along the southern coast of Laconia in Greece when he noticed something on the seafloor that didn't belong. Outlines, right angles, the unmistakable geometry of human design lying in 4 meters of clear Aegean water. Stone walls running in parallel lines. Rectangular foundations arranged along what could only be described as streets. Fleming had not discovered a scatter of ruins. He had discovered a town. Pavlo-Petri sits off the village of Paunta in the Peloponnese, submerged but almost entirely intact. The water is so shallow and so clear that on a calm day, a swimmer floating above the site can trace the layout of the city with their own eyes. Streets running between blocks of houses, courtyards opening off main thoroughfares, tombs grouped at the periphery. The grid is complete. The plan is legible. A diver descending to the seafloor can walk the original streets of a Bronze Age town that was already ancient when Homer's poets first began composing the Iliad. In 2009, a team from the University of Nottingham, led by archaeologist John Henderson, conducted the first comprehensive underwater survey of the site using digital photogrammetry and sonar mapping. The results were staggering. Pavlo-Petri wasn't a small fishing hamlet or a temporary settlement. It was a sophisticated urban center with a planned street grid, organized residential districts, and dedicated burial zones. The town had been continuously occupied for over 2,000 years before it disappeared beneath the sea. People had been born there, lived there, buried their dead there, traded their goods there for longer than the entire span of recorded history between the fall of Rome and the present day. Then, around 1000 BCE, the ground beneath them gave way. The destruction mechanism was not a single eruption or a single wave. It was subsidence, the slow geological sinking of the land itself, accelerated almost certainly by one or more catastrophic earthquakes along the seismically active faults that run beneath the Laconian coast. The earth dropped. The sea moved in. A city that had stood for 2 millennia became a city beneath the water. What makes Pavlo-Petri the most haunting entry on this list so far is not its destruction. It's its preservation. The town did not collapse into rubble. It did not burn. It did not get crushed under pyroclastic flow or scoured by debris. It simply sank, intact, and the calm, shallow waters of the bay sealed it like a museum exhibit. The streets a Bronze Age child once ran down are still there. The doorways their parents passed through every morning are still there. The grave plots where their ancestors were laid to rest are still there. All of it sitting 4 meters below the surface, perfectly arranged, perfectly empty. Pavlo-Petri is the oldest known submerged town with a planned urban grid anywhere on Earth. It predates every other underwater city archaeologists have cataloged. It predates the foundation of Rome by centuries. It predates the rise of classical Greece. And it raises a question that becomes more uncomfortable the longer you sit with it. If the calm waters of a Greek bay could swallow a fully developed urban settlement and preserve it so completely that we can still walk its streets? How many other towns sit beneath shallower seas, on continental shelves, in coastal lagoons, that we simply have not yet thought to look at? The Mediterranean is dotted with bays exactly like this one. The geological forces that dropped Pavlopetri beneath the waves are not extinct. They are not even rare. The town survived for 2,000 years. The sinking took a single afternoon, and what waited above Pavlopetri's quiet grid for nearly 3,000 years was nothing more than the suggestion that something far larger, far more famous, and far better documented could vanish the same way. Number 2. The destruction of Helik. In 373 BCE, on the northern coast of the Peloponnese, a thriving Greek city went to sleep beside the Gulf of Corinth and never woke up. By morning, Helik was gone. Not damaged, not in ruins. Gone. The entire city, its temples, its harbor, its sanctuary of Poseidon Heliconios, famous across the Greek world, the streets where children had played the previous afternoon, all of it had vanished beneath the waters of the Gulf in a single night. The witnesses to its disappearance were not mythmakers writing centuries after the fact. They were Greek and Roman geographers who could still see what had happened. Strabo, writing roughly 3 centuries later, described how the city had been submerged so completely that travelers could sail over its ruins and see the bronze statue of Poseidon standing upright on the seafloor, his trident catching the light from above. Pausanias, the meticulous 2nd century traveler who documented the sacred sites of Greece, recorded the disaster as one of the most famous calamities in the Greek memory. Roman tourists came for centuries. They hired local boatmen. They rowed out over the drowned city and looked down through the clear Mediterranean water at the columns and walls of a civilization that had been erased in minutes. The ancient accounts agree on the mechanism. An earthquake struck in the depths of the night, violent enough to shatter the coastal plain. Within minutes, the ground beneath Heliki subsided. The Gulf of Corinth rushed in. A tsunami followed, swallowing whatever the collapsing earth had not already consumed. 10 Spartan warships anchored in the harbor were destroyed in the same instant. Every inhabitant of the city died. The Achaean League lost one of its most important members in a single geological convulsion. But here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. The ancient sources record that Helika's destruction was preceded by warnings. Pausanias and Strabo both describe a strange luminescence in the sky in the days before the collapse, a green glow that the ancient writers interpreted as an omen. They describe animals fleeing the city in the days before the disaster. Mice, snakes, weasels, centipedes, all of them streaming out of Helik toward higher ground in the days preceding the earthquake, as if responding to something the human inhabitants could not perceive. Modern seismologists have documented analogous phenomena before major earthquakes. Electromagnetic disturbances producing atmospheric glows. Animal behavioral changes in response to ground vibrations and gas releases below human sensory thresholds. The Greeks were not inventing portents. They were recording, with remarkable accuracy, the geophysical precursors of a coastal collapse that geologists would not understand for another 2,500 years. Helik's people saw the signs. They did not understand them. The city's fate became proverbial in the ancient world. Helik was the great example of how the gods could erase a city for hubris, for offending Poseidon, for sins recorded and unrecorded. It was discussed by Aristotle. It was referenced by Diodorus Siculus, and the location was eventually lost. The shoreline shifted. The lagoon that had marked the disaster silted up. The sunken statue of Poseidon disappeared beneath sediment as the bay slowly filled. By the medieval period, no one knew exactly where Helik had been. Then, in 2001, archaeologists Dora Katsanopoulou and Stephen Soter announced that they had found it. Not on the seafloor of the Gulf of Corinth, where the Romans had once rowed above its columns, but buried inland beneath the alluvial plain that had grown over the drowned lagoon in the centuries after the disaster. The city had been entombed twice, first by water, then by silt. Excavations have since uncovered classical period walls, pottery, and the unmistakable destruction layer of the 373 BCE event. Helike is the closest thing in the historical record to a confirmed Atlantis. A wealthy, sophisticated city sunk in a single night by forces it could not comprehend, its memory preserved in the writings of those who came after, its physical remains buried for nearly 2.5 millennia beneath the country that survived it. Plato was writing his Atlantis dialogues within decades of Helike's destruction. He almost certainly knew what had happened on the Achaean coast. Whether or not he drew on it directly, the lesson was already written into the Greek consciousness. A city could be there in the evening and gone by dawn. The sea was patient. The earth was not loyal. Number 1. The Thera eruption, the death of the first great European civilization. In 1967, archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavations at Akrotiri on the southern tip of the Greek island of Santorini. What he uncovered beneath meters of volcanic ash was extraordinary. A complete Bronze Age city preserved like Pompeii, multi-story buildings with intact staircases, sophisticated drainage systems running beneath paved streets, frescoes of such astonishing artistry that they wouldn't be matched in European painting for another 1,000 years. The city had been frozen in time by a volcanic eruption so powerful it reshaped the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean and rewrote the trajectory of human civilization. Approximately 3,600 years ago, around 1600 BCE, the volcano that formed Santorini detonated in one of the most violent eruptions of the last 10,000 years. The eruption expelled an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of magma into the atmosphere, 4 times the volume ejected by Krakatoa in 1883. The Volcanic Explosivity Index rates the Thera event at 7, placing it among the most powerful volcanic eruptions in the entire Holocene record. The ash column rose more than 30 kilometers into the sky, punching through the stratosphere and seeding the upper atmosphere with sulfur aerosols that would dim sunlight across the entire northern hemisphere. The center of the island collapsed into the sea, creating the distinctive crescent caldera that defines Santorini's shape today. A geological feature visible from orbit. A wound from which an ocean poured. The numbers are staggering, but the numbers are not what destroyed the civilization. Akrotiri, miraculously, shows no human remains. The population appears to have evacuated before the final cataclysm, likely warned by preliminary seismic activity that gave them hours or days to flee. They escaped the island. They did not escape the eruption. Tsunami modeling by geologist Kostas Sinolakis suggests waves reaching 35 meters in height struck the northern coast of Crete just 110 kilometers to the south, arriving within 30 minutes of the caldera's collapse. Crete was the heart of the Minoan civilization, the first advanced civilization in European history. The Minoans had built palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. They possessed a written language we still cannot fully read. They maintained trade networks spanning from Egypt to Anatolia. They created art of a sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for 1,000 years after their disappearance. And on a single afternoon, walls of water taller than a 10-story building swept across their northern coast, obliterating their harbors, their merchant fleets, their coastal settlements, and the maritime infrastructure that had made them the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean. But here's where the destruction becomes generational rather than instantaneous. The eruption injected millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating an aerosol veil that cooled the planet for years. Tree ring data from bog oaks in Ireland, bristlecone pines in California, and subfossil trees in Sweden show a pronounced growth anomaly in the mid-second millennium BCE. A global signal of dimmed sunlight and shortened growing seasons preserved in wood thousands of kilometers from the eruption site. For a civilization already reeling from the destruction of its fleet and its harbors, The years of failed harvests that followed were the killing blow. Within a generation of the eruption, Minoan civilization entered terminal decline. Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland moved into Crete and assumed control of the palace complexes. The Minoan language disappeared. Their art traditions fragmented. A culture that had thrived for over 1,000 years was consumed by a civilization that had been subordinate to it just decades earlier. In 1909, the British scholar K.T. Frost proposed something that has haunted the historical imagination ever since. He suggested that the destruction of Thera and the collapse of the Minoans provided the historical foundation for Plato's story of Atlantis. A powerful island civilization advanced beyond its neighbors, destroyed in a single terrible day, and swallowed by the sea. Whether or not the Minoans were Atlantis, the parallel is precise. An advanced island culture at the height of its power, erased by forces erupting from beneath the earth it stood on. The first great civilization of Europe ended in fire and water. The frescoes remain. The script remains undeciphered. And the caldera remains, filled with the sea that drowned a world. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.